Welcome back to In-Depth Literature, the struggle to depict the positively good man. That was the concern, that was the struggle with Dostoevsky's The Idiot that we finally finished. Well, I finished it almost a month ago now, and we are continuing the Dostoevsky project. We've been blowing through Dostoevsky like crazy over here on In-Depth Literature. We've read House of the Dead, we've covered Humiliated and Insulted, we've also covered previously Notes from the Underground as well as The Double, and we're well on our way, almost halfway through Devils as well. I like to collect the Oxford World Classics editions. The Penguin ones are really great too. A lot of really good translations overall. There's some other really good publishers that collaborate with Dostoevsky and Dostoevsky translators as well. But we are going to be discussing The Idiot today, as the title of this video states. And The Idiot is a rather lengthy Dostoevsky work. It's rather complicated. It's scandalous. It's dark. It's treacherous. There's a lot of drama. There's a lot of hysteria and fever and paranoia and death and destruction and all the things that we would expect from a great Dostoevsky novel. Now, sort of the premise for The Idiot, in the words of Dostoevsky himself, was to depict sort of a Christ-like, holy, good-natured man amongst the corrupt society, amongst the evils and corruption of St. Petersburg, as well as sort of his immediate familial surroundings. Prince Labyedkev, let me just make sure I pronounce this right. Nikolayevich Mishkin, Prince Lev Nikolayevich Mishkin, is the central protagonist of The Idiot, and he sort of interacts with all these other characters, namely Natasya Filipovna Barashova, the Yapunchin family, obviously with the three daughters. Aglaya is probably the main daughter, the main character daughter among the Yapunchin family. Now, the villain of The Idiot is Rogozin. Also have Totsky, Vadia, Lebedev, as well as Ippolit. He's another interesting character that contrasts with Prince Mishkin. And sort of Dostoevsky's struggle with The Idiot was not only the various drafts and rewrites that took place for us to finally get to the the version of The Idiot that we see today. Originally, Dostoevsky had depicted Prince Mishkin as a villain, but somewhere along the line he sort of revised and sort of rehashed his whole plan, and The Idiot, sort of the motivation for The Idiot was to depict the positively good natured, holy man, sort of a Christ-like figure. And we can sort of view Prince Mishkin as sort of a, I guess, sort of modern Christ, in terms of modern times as when Dostoevsky was living. But Dostoevsky struggled and even said that The Idiot was ultimately a failure. But Dostoevsky readers and Dostoevsky scholars and literature enthusiasts, we do not see The Idiot as a failure. Yes, it is rambly. It's a little confusing at times. There's a lot of overly dense philosophical descriptions and dialogue. But hell, that's what we read Dostoevsky for, is sort of for that, hyper-analytical approach that Dostoevsky possesses. That's why I love Thomas Wolfe and even some Ernest Hemingway and David Foster Wallace. And, I love those overly sort of Hemingway's a little bit different, but I love the sort of the hyper analytical, overly descriptive, disturbingly detailed, I should say, writers like Dostoevsky and Thomas Wolfe, among other writers. We're branching out, we're reading all sorts of things. But Dostoevsky, and among Tolstoy, as well as, Cervantes, and who's the other book we just read, Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I really love, those really dense writers, because you get such an immersive, beautiful, lifelike experience. So anyway, before I interrupted myself, Dostoevsky struggled not only with the process of writing The Idiot, but at the time he was in extreme gambling debts. He was living not in Russia at the time. He had fled his creditors. I think he was living in Switzerland, something to that effect, similar to Prince Mishkin. But he was struggling with gambling addiction, gambling debts. Some of his familial relationships were falling apart. He was in extreme poverty, had a lot of family tragedies. So that was also sort of the catalyst for sort of writing The Idiot, or sort of fueled a lot of the character interactions and some of the things that take place throughout the pages of The Idiot. Now, obviously, we sort of have this Christ-like figure among these monsters in St. Petersburg, these cutthroat people. But we also sort of have on a philosophical level this critique of Roman Catholicism that takes place throughout, in terms of sort of how it is corrupt, number one, or Dostoevsky believed it was corrupt at that time. So we have the critique and sort of the attack on Roman Catholicism, but also atheism comes up, and sort of these anti-socialist, sort of liberal ideologues would, I guess you would suggest, come up in the pages of The Idiot. And by this time, after, and I will say before I explain the next part of this, that a really good precursor to The Idiot, and I think in actual publication order, you should definitely read House of the Dead, which we've actually covered. I forgot to mention that too. We've covered House of the Dead, probably one of my favorite Dostoevsky works, but it definitely sets up the stage for some of the philosophical and political, as well as emotional, spiritual, religious themes that Prince Mishkin, is sort of entangled with, or is sort of passionate about, and sort of promotes in the pages of The Idiot. So we have sort of the critique of Roman Catholicism, as we said, and atheism, but also this focus on Russian Orthodoxy. And by this time, Dostoevsky was obviously sort of a Slavophile. If you're not familiar with Slavophiles, they were advocates for Russian culture, Russian Orthodoxy in general, Christian values. They did support the emancipation of the serfs, which is cool, but they sort of, from the research and the impression that I'm getting, they didn't like sort of the anti-religious, I guess you could say, sort of more Western European influences that were sort of starting to, be combined, or sort of started to erode Russian, more Slavic lifestyles and cultures and religions and so on and so forth. So that is another aspect to The Idiot that is definitely worth exploring. And the reason we brought up notes from the House of the Dead, because sort of Prince Mishkin in the beginning, he is he had just returned from Switzerland in the novel, and I think I said that Dostoevsky was in Switzerland. I'm not exactly sure about that, but I know that Prince Mishkin obviously had, in the novel, fictitiously, he had been spending time in Switzerland for epilepsy. That's another thing I forgot to mention too, was that Dostoevsky was suffering from severe bouts of epilepsy that sort of began during his time in Siberia, and we read about that in the House of the Dead. So the House of the Dead is an extremely important precursor to The Idiot, because it dovetails time, throughout the timeline of Dostoevsky's life, and also sort of how we got to, Dostoevsky's pre-Siberian novels, and then, how his artistic and sort of literature vision evolved and changed with the post-Siberian exile novels. So it's a really important, piece of literature, that being the House of the Dead, that you should not brush over. I don't recommend picking up Dostoevsky's really long, philosophical, lengthy novels if you haven't read his earlier works, because, a lot of people I see on BookTube or literature tube, whatever, they sort of want a challenge, so they'll pick up Devils or The Idiot, perhaps, and Brothers Karamazov is obviously a very, very popular one as well. And, reading Dostoevsky is great. You'll get something out of it, but it's almost like jumping to, eighth grade when you haven't even, done the previous grades. You haven't sat through fifth, sixth, seventh, or whatever. Dostoevsky is sort of evolves and changes and sort of blossoms philosophically and emotionally and spiritually over the course of his many struggles throughout his life. And also sort of the socio-political realm of St. Petersburg, and, the Tsar and the various conflicts that took place, the emancipation of the serfs, and all the stuff that we've been sort of talking about in the realm of Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is really sort of a history lesson, similar to Tolstoy, but Tolstoy is a little bit more philosophically and sort of sociopolitically different. He focuses on slightly different themes, but Dostoevsky also does that for us. And with many Russian novelists, not all of them, you definitely get sort of a panoramic history lesson of Russian culture, religious orthodoxy culture, and just St. Petersburg and all the interesting places and characters over the course of Russian history. Working our way back to the idiot, what was the point of Dostoevsky trying to depict this figure? Was an the idiot is semi-autobiographical, as many of Dostoevsky's works are, but like we've been discussing, it's not just as simple as Prince Mishkin is this holy, lofty character, this good-natured character, and that he gets screwed over by everybody else in the novel, and the novel's over. No, it's much more complicated than that on a socio-political realm and sort of a spiritual, emotional evolution. And the characters, pretty much all of them, sort of either reflect or combat or force Prince Mishkin to sort of question his intentions. They question his own spirituality. Every single character in this book sort of not necessarily mirrors, but sort of, I guess, comes into conflict with Prince Mishkin's sort of Christ-like naivety, perhaps. And another important thing to mention is the influence that the painting Christ in the Tomb by Hans Holbein, that is actually featured on the cover, but the cover actually doesn't do the entire painting justice, because you have to see the whole thing, because that painting by Hans Holbein affected Dostoevsky on such a viscerally spiritual, profound, philosophical level that he even started to question his faith, and he wrote letters about it. And he sort of weaves that into the fictional world of the idiot, brilliantly, I think, in my opinion. And we sort of see how that painting by Hans Holbein, or any idea, any sort of depiction of Christ, or history of Christ rather, sort of serves as sort of this allegorical exploration, or this allegorical vessel for Dostoevsky to sort of create Prince Mishkin, right? So Prince Mishkin is not that he is necessarily Christ, because he's not that holy, he doesn't perform miracles, yada yada, but he sort of has that willingness to accept everybody's flaws, oftentimes to the detriment of his own. Dostoevsky's characters throughout many of his novels, they are either overly giving, or they're overly narcissistic and sort of maybe nihilistic, perhaps. But Prince Mishkin is like sort of the one of the quintessential positive, good-natured, religious Dostoevsky characters. So it's kind of a Dostoevsky one-off in that sense, because although we have some other good-natured Dostoevsky characters, I think Prince Mishkin is pretty much the primary. And Dostoevsky even said himself that The Idiot was his most beloved novel, in his opinion. The critics were not 100% happy with it. Even today, some people critique the novel for, those critiques are sort of valid. The fact that some people say it's unorganized, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but you have to spend time with it and sort of understand what Dostoevsky was going through. A lot of Dostoevsky's novels were written under financial pressure. Sometimes he was experimenting. Sometimes he would just kind of make things. Sometimes he would just kind of make things up as he went along. With the dialogue and sort of philosophically, and sort of that freedom of Dostoevsky's style. This is not going to be an overview of Dostoevsky's style, but that sort of always being on the precipice of not necessarily knowing what was going to happen with each chapter, from one chapter to another, to these characters, kind of offers it sort of almost a more realistic sort of experience, because it's more like real life. Real life is not planned out like a novel is, and obviously Dostoevsky planned to a certain extent his novels and his stories and his character arcs. But if I'm making sense, does that make sense? I think it lends itself a little more to like a real life experience. Kind of like when you're watching a TV show. Obviously, it's all planned out on the creative end, but the spectator, the viewer, is like on the edge of his seat, because he wants to know what's going to happen to his favorite characters. He doesn't know. There's a lot of anticipation there, so we get that a lot with The Idiot. Going back to Prince Mishkin, he goes through all of these. His flaws are reflected not only in his overly giving nature, sort of his naivety, but also his passion for Christ and the painting that we discussed, and sort of his insistence that Russian culture and orthodoxy, be preserved, and that the other characters around him should be living a similar life to him. It's not that he's necessarily trying to convert people or that he's saying that he's better than everybody else, but we get this impression that he sort of has, I don't want to say a chip on his shoulder, but he has sort of this sense of martyrdom, and that comes up with his struggles with Natasya Filipovna, and he's sort of, obviously he's in love with her, but then he eventually ends up falling in love with this other woman, and he's with the other woman, I think, is Aglaya, I want to say, the main daughter of the Yapanchin, family, the Yapanchin parents, and they sort of serve as sort of the familial vessel. The Yapanchin family is also another group of characters that Dostoevsky interacts with that sort of cause him to sort of further his endeavors on trying to be this really overly good, caring, giving sort of I don't want to say peacemaker, but that's kind of what Prince Mishkin is. He's kind of like this sort of this character that wants the best for everybody and wants the best for society, but it's oftentimes to his own detriment. And we get the sense that as the novel sort of starts to kind of circle its way back towards the end, the characters sort of in a way become full circle, and we sort of get the sense that these other characters are not taking Prince Mishkin seriously, and Prince Mishkin, almost like he's unaware of his own naivety. So it's not that he's like an infantile character, but in some ways he is very naive and he's overly giving, and he's sort of he doesn't really have any earthly sins. He's not lustful, he's not greedy. He does briefly inherit money throughout the novel, and we can sort of see how the other characters flock to people that have money. And another concern, like we mentioned Natasya Filipovna, he is attracted to her, because she's beautiful and she's got this sort of dark, not only dark eyes and dark hair, but she has sort of this dark aura, this sort of allure, this sort of mysterious, dark, seductive quality to her. But she has a history with Totsky, I believe, and Totsky was sort of her guardian, but he abused her. And I don't want to give away everything in the plot, but the relationship between Prince Mishkin and Natasya Filipovna is extremely important because it comes full circle, like we said, towards the end. With another character, which is Rogozin. He's a pretty famous villain, and I don't want to tell you what he actually does at the end of the novel, but it's a terrible tragedy, and it comes into conflict completely with sort of everything that Prince Mishkin has worked so hard for, or the worldview, I should say, that Prince Mishkin has constructed for himself. And we would maybe expect, I was reading some of the comments on Reddit and on the internet, and it's like, why did Prince Mishkin not, try to get revenge on Rogozin? And because Prince Mishkin, even by the end of the novel, he doesn't change his tune. So, like I said, Prince Mishkin does not change his tune just because of the failures and the sins of the other characters, no matter how rotten and nasty and sociopathic they may be. Prince Mishkin accepts people. He accepts people for their flaws. Some of it is a little outlandish because, Prince Mishkin has this desire to save everybody and be this Christ-like, wonderful person, but not only to the detriment of himself and his own emotions and his own mental health, but he ends up sort of inadvertently being an accomplice and letting other people get away with terrible things. But that makes him more holy, but it also makes him more naive. And I don't necessarily mean holy because he's not necessarily a Christ-like figure on a religious and spiritual level, but he is sort of metaphorically like this modern day Christ, right? That's kind of what Dostoevsky was trying to get at. But he also uses Dostoevsky, like we said, to sort of further, and I'm saying, speaking of Dostoevsky, he uses Prince Mishkin as sort of a vessel to promote his, Slavophile-esque ideas and sort of his socio-religious political views as well. And we see that, I'm not going to go through all my annotations here, but the many characters and events and conflicts and dramas that come up. Sort of the whole novel and all the characters within it are constantly testing Dostoevsky, right? Or they're constantly testing Prince Mishkin to see if he's going to break, if he's going to change his tune, if he's going to, renounce his faith. But that never happens. Prince Mishkin remains, dedicated to his faith. So I did want to discuss a little bit of this idea of the ideal man living in the corrupt society focused on wealth, vanity, money, and sort of also we discussed the burgeoning embrace of more Western, maybe perhaps Roman Catholic, or even just anti-religious, more like Enlightenment type of ideas that Dostoevsky was definitely not a fan of. Yes, he did embrace some of those ideas initially, like that's how we ended up, getting put in a firing squad that we discussed. The Tsar kind of captured him, and the political espionage literature scene that we discussed in Notes from the House of the Dead. And that's why it's really important to read Notes from the House of the Dead, because philosophically, and even just like we said with the timeline of Dostoevsky's life, it sets up these other characters like Prince Mishkin and all the other characters that we later see in Devils. Some translations call it demons. Mine is called devils. You just can't see it because there's light reflecting. As you can see, yeah, mine is referred to as devils, and that's why I'm sort of a enthusiast for reading Dostoevsky in order, and because that way you experience Dostoevsky's socio-political and spiritual, emotional evolution along with him, versus just kind of cherry picking bits and pieces of Dostoevsky's worldview and passions sort of out of order. And that's okay to do too. I'm not saying, but to me, really, in my experience, that's the best way to read an author, is kind of in order. Obviously, it doesn't always happen like that. Sometimes we pick up, I don't know, something from the middle of Faulkner's catalog or the middle of Thomas Wolfe's catalog, or, like for me, for example, I just picked up Infinite Jest, kind of not out of the blue. I knew a lot about David Foster Wallace and what I was getting into, but I didn't start from David Foster Wallace's early college essays and Girl with Curious Hair and all that. I just picked up Infinite Jest because Infinite Jest has a reputation. And I will say that novels like Infinite Jest or War and Peace or even Brothers Karamazov, those really heavy, dense sort of philosophical novels, you don't have to be well versed in the author's other work to get something out of it. That would be foolish and sort of elitist and stuffy to say. No, you don't have to be an expert on Dostoevsky to pick up any of his novels, but I'm saying it will behoove you. I really hate that word, but I said it anyway. It will benefit you, I guess is what I'm trying to say, much greater than just picking up one of his works without sort of knowing the context of Dostoevsky. Now, mentioning previously the Dostoevsky or Prince Mishkin's critique of Roman Catholicism, the reason that from Dostoevsky's worldview, he sort of believed, and this comes up in the novel too, there's a lot of speeches and a lot of letters that are exchanged, and Prince Mishkin and Dostoevsky, we'll talk about them interchangeably, sort of believed that Roman Catholicism was sort of a sort of almost a fake religion. And my family heritage is Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, in fact, and I sort of have somewhat of a prejudice toward Catholicism too. I'm not saying Catholic people are bad, or, every religion sort of wants to say that, oh, we're the first religion, we're the original, we're the pure, we're the real version of Christianity. They all have their faults. They all have their various inconsistencies and sort of hypocrisies within them. But Catholicism, I'm not going to go on an anti-Catholicism rant, but it's a very sort of hypocritical faith in many ways, going all the way back, to the early church fathers and, the old, philosophical concepts of the canon. And, that's not really my area of expertise. Maybe you can go watch, some religious scholars or religious debates, more like a Jay Dyer type thing, to get more information on that end. But we can see why Dostoevsky and sort of a lot of Slavophiles, Russian Orthodoxies didn't want sort of the influence of Catholicism or even Roman Catholicism to sort of taint Russian culture, because Roman Catholicism and Catholicism in general during, not even starting from the medieval period and going all the way up to the time Dostoevsky lived, was still very, very powerful. They still are today, but not quite to the capacity that they were in sort of the old days like the hundreds, 1800s. But we can see why, uh, Dostoevsky didn't want, or we can see why he wanted to preserve sort of the Russian Orthodox culture. Like any other nation or any other religious culture should do, they should be proud of their heritage, sort of their worldview and their religious culture. But before I interrupted myself, Dostoevsky sort of blamed socialism and sort of these more perhaps neoliberal ideas that we saw during that time as sort of being in cahoots with Catholicism, or that the reason that we had so many nihilists and atheists and socialists was because of sort of this dishonest endeavor by Roman Catholicism to sort of corrupt various systems, with the pursuit of wealth, power, and sort of almost like subversion. Dostoevsky sort of viewed Roman Catholicism as sort of a fake religion, a subversive religion, a version of Christianity that was not really about the teachings of Christ, was not really advocating for the Gospels, was more about enriching themselves and sort of using the populace as a way to sort of further the endeavors of the Roman Catholic Church. So whether or not you agree with that or disagree with that, like I said, I'm not an expert on Orthodoxy. I'm not an expert on Roman Catholicism or the history of the religion, but I will say that Catholicism just kind of rubs me the wrong way, not only because of all the abuse scandals that obviously have happened, but sort of the way that they've held so much wealth and so much power over the course of history. And I think Dostoevsky was kind of aware of that. So also sort of the Roman Catholicism thirst for sort of the socio-political control. And Dostoevsky writes about this in The Idiot, and that's another sort of way that Dostoevsky sort of weaves to further his point of the power and the supremacy, I guess you could say, of Russian Orthodoxy and more Slavic cultural identity over sort of the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church that had been corrupting and sort of fucking things up for centuries and centuries. So we can kind of whether or not we agree with Dostoevsky on that level, we can see the argument there, right? We can see the corruption of the Catholic Church going all the way back from the medieval times to where it is now. It's still corrupt. Of course, the Orthodox churches are not void of corruption and money seeking and power. Of course, every church, every sort of institution, political and religious, sort of, they're all hungry for the same things, right? And I did mention that my family is Greek Orthodox, but I wasn't raised Greek Orthodox. I don't even really consider myself sort of a religious person. Yes, I got the icons in the background because I think they're beautiful. I think they're holy, and I think you can, say a prayer, say the Lord's Prayer, and look at the icon, and do the sign of the cross, and sort of you can use Christianity as a vessel. And a lot of people are going to hate me for saying this, but you can use Christianity or any religious activity as a vessel to just have a conversation with God, have a conversation with the cosmos without being sort of a staunch religious believer in every single aspect and every single figure of that religion. So hopefully that makes sense. We got a little off topic there, but obviously with The Idiot, sort of in a nutshell, there's a lot of things we could say about The Idiot, but it's sort of a socio-political and religious critique of sort of advocating for Russian Orthodoxy, Russian culture, but also sort of this and it's not anti-Western or anti-socialist just for the sole fact of being a political being the opposite side politically. It's more of sort of the reason that Dostoevsky and Prince Mishkin are advocating for these things is for the spiritual betterment and the sort of socio-political and spiritual, emotional betterment of all these characters that exist within Russian culture in St. Petersburg. And obviously, other themes come up throughout the course of The Idiot, like capital punishment and sort of the struggle between good and evil. On a basic level, yes, it's about good and evil. It's about a Christ-like figure in a corrupt society, yes. But also, there's sort of all these other sort of complicated, or I should say more complicated socio-political themes that sort of come to the forefront that are very important to mention. Also, there is obviously the complicated love triangle between Prince Mishkin and Natasya Filipovna and Rogozin and the daughter of the Yapanshin parents, because Dostoevsky or Prince Mishkin is trying to juggle, two different love affairs, and sort of the character arc, I should say, of Natasya Filipovna is tragic. It's almost like a Anna Karenina-esque, I guess you could say, but a little more demented, a little more dark, a little more deranged. But it's sort of like the character arc of Anna Karenina, where we see this tragic woman figure that just cannot be saved from her own evils, from her own impulses, and she ends up going back to Rogozin, who is, been sort of the abuser, I guess you would say. Not only was she abused by her upbringing, by I think his name was Totsky. Not only she was corrupted. Her innocence was stolen from her during her sort of adopted upbringing with Totsky, and then therefore she's already broken by the time we meet her. And Dostoevsky is really brilliant about sort of showing us sort of a panoramic kaleidoscope-esque view of all the characters' backgrounds, and conversations come up, arguments happen, and that's kind of how Dostoevsky introduces the different levels and character motivations and character arcs of his characters. But Natasya Filipovna in particular is sort of the tragic heroine, the tragic Anna Karenina type-esque figure in this novel, and we sort of feel for her, but also like Anna Karenina perhaps. And I'm just using that as an example. I don't think it was necessarily influenced by Anna Karenina, but I'm just using that as an example because we sort of have that sort of character arc in Dostoevsky as well. And obviously the book is a tragedy, but it's also sort of puts into question how we should act among evil people, among evil in society, how we should act when people betray us, so on and so forth. So it's a fascinating, addition to the Dostoevsky project. Just a wonderful work overall. It's heavy, it's dense, it can be confusing at times. Sometimes you're scratching your head, asking yourself, where the hell is this going to go? But it all, like I said, it all comes full circle by the end. I'm not going to tell you the ending because I want you to read it. But yeah, I could rant all day about The Idiot, but those are sort of the same, the main central themes. Let me know if you agree. What do you think those are the central themes? Is there anything that you think I missed or is worth exploring? And I will say in conclusion, that's so corny, I will say at the end that, The Idiot, not unlike Dostoevsky's other works, I encourage you to read them throughout your life multiple times. Like Thomas Wolfe, we're reading You Can't Go Home Again for the second time. We've read Of Time in the River twice. We've read Oh Lost and Look Homeward Angel several times. So that, I might come back to this a couple years from now after reading it again with maybe a different perspective. Maybe I'll believe that the focus is a little bit different than I originally did, but those are sort of the main impressions, the main themes, the main passions, the main motivations for these various characters, and sort of the philosophical, socio-political, spiritual dialogue that occurs in The Idiot. So thank you so much for stopping by In-Depth Literature. Make sure you guys like, share, and subscribe. Hopefully you had a nice glass of wine or some coffee or a cup of tea as you listen to this. Let me know some other lesser known facts about Dostoevsky. Let me know some different ways to approach Dostoevsky's work, The Idiot in particular, and we will be back with more content very soon. I really appreciate all the likes and all the new subscribers and all the comments. It really means a lot. And your support helps me to keep going on here as well. You can donate to In-Depth Literature Project on Cash App at In-Depth Literature. Please follow me on Substack as well at In-Depth Literature. We will see everybody in the next one.